I'm going to talk to you today about the Founding Fathers and their use of a variety of clandestine operations as a tool of foreign policy and also as part of their wartime efforts during the American Revolution. I have to say that I've been returning to this issue of the Founding Fathers and covert operations for the past 30 years. I first began looking at this question during the Iran-Contra hearings of 1987. And I'm repeatedly stunned by the myth, that I call it the myth that will not die. And the myth is that clandestine operations and their control by the chief executive was a cancerous growth on the Constitution that began in the 20th century with the so-called imperial presidency. And I call this a fairy tale account of American history. It was promulgated by the Church Committee back in 1975-76 during the nation's bicentennial, which, if you can, for those of you old enough to recall that time, was an event that was overshadowed by Watergate, by the collapse of South Vietnam, and by revelations of CIA domestic operations at home and assassination plots abroad. The notion that the United States had lost its bearings, had drifted from the intentions of the Founding Fathers, permeated the media coverage of the bicentennial and also was frequently found in various academic scholarship at the time, which dealt with the nation's 200th birthday. This theme, by the way, that somehow we had gone adrift and had abandoned the principles and practices of the Founding Fathers, was somewhat central to Jimmy Carter's campaign for president in 1976. And it's interesting to note that Carter selected Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale, a very prominent member of the Church Committee, to be his running mate. And this was a signal that it would no longer be business as usual regarding the nation's intelligence community under this new Carter-Mondale administration. The idea that the Founding Fathers would have rejected the clandestine practices of 20th century, of their 20th and 21st century successors, also found its way into the majority report of the Iran-Contra Committee in 1987. And I should add that this distorted understanding of American history now finds renewed life on the libertarian right. And you can see this particularly in the speeches and writings of Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Congressman Justin Amash of Michigan. Amash, by the way, has allied himself with some of the most liberal members of Congress, including Representative John Conyers and other holdovers of the McGovern wing of the Democratic Party. And both Rand Paul and Amash, along with some members of the so-called House Freedom Caucus, have expressed support for the defector Edward Snowden, with Amash praising him as a whistleblower and Rand Paul arguing that history will be kind to Snowden. Both Amash and Paul consider themselves to be defenders of the Constitution. They refer to the Constitution constantly, and they see themselves as the true heirs to the framers. But I would argue that this is patently false. For all of the key founders, Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Jay, all of them worked the dark side, so to speak, to borrow from Dick Cheney, throughout their careers in the executive branch. So enlisting the founders in the cause of restricting or banning covert operations can only be achieved by distorting or ignoring the historical record. So let me give you some specific examples of what I'm talking about here. We'll start with the most prominent founder of all, George Washington, who of course had to face off against the superpower of his time. And Washington understood, being outnumbered, outsupplied, outmanned, that deception was a critical force multiplier, as we would say today. One of Washington's first acts upon taking command of the Continental Army was to hire a spy. This is in Cambridge, Mass., hiring a spy to go into Boston where the British were encamped. Those of you who've watched AMC's production of Turn are well familiar with Washington's use of the Culper spy ring in and around New York City later in the American Revolution. So he put great importance on gathering intelligence, but also attempting to deceive his enemy regarding his own intentions. You should know that, or I believe it's important to know, that 11% of Washington's total military expenditures during the American Revolution were spent on intelligence operations. So this was a substantial commitment of resources on Washington's part, and it included, by the way, the use of some of his own private funds. There were times, due to the inefficiencies of the Continental Congress, where Washington simply dipped into his own pocket to sustain some of his intelligence operatives in the field. I mention that because the Iran-Contra report made a big issue out of so-called privatizing intelligence operations. Washington also routinely withheld information from the Continental Congress. And let me just give you, I'm not going to bury you under a pile of quotations here, but this is, I think, a very revealing statement by George Washington, written after the American Revolution, but in defense of secrecy and intelligence operations. Quote, "There are some secrets on which depends the salvation of an army, secrets which cannot be entrusted to paper, and which none but the commander-in-chief at the time should be acquainted with." And throughout the duration of that war, of the Revolutionary War, Washington frequently kept his congressional overseers in the dark in terms of what he was up to, partly because he simply had no trust whatsoever that they would be able to preserve secrets. Now, in saying this, I don't want you to think that Washington gravitated to the use of these operations with great zeal. He had real concerns about the kind of individuals that one had to employ to conduct espionage and covert operations. In other words, a lot of these individuals would be ethically challenged, we might say. And Washington referred to them as ambiguous characters. Ambiguous characters. But nonetheless, he employed them to an incredible extent during the war. I should also mention, due to the disputes that have taken place, or the controversy that has taken place in the last 3 to 4 years regarding the revelations of Edward Snowden and NSC surveillance, Washington was a believer in mail opening. In other words, he instructed his agents who were operating behind enemy lines to attempt to intercept the mail of American Tory sympathizers and, of course, the British military. And he even at one point offered fairly detailed instructions as to how to open an envelope, read the contents, insert the letter back in, and to seal it up so that no one would know it had been opened. So this was a man who was very comfortable with the idea of mail opening as an intelligence tool, and I think if Rand Paul and Justin Amash and Patrick Leahy and the American Civil Liberties Union were aware of this, they'd be less likely to invoke the Founding Fathers in terms of making a case against some of the NSA's surveillance programs. Washington also believed in the use of clergymen as intelligence agents, and I bring this up because this was one of the criticisms that the Church Committee directed against the CIA and various American presidents. There's a great story where there were 2 British soldiers who had been captured, British officers who had been captured and who were about to be executed because they were out of uniform, therefore considered to be spies. A clergyman was sent in to sort of admit, to take the last confession of these officers before they were executed. But before the clergyman was sent in, Washington met with this clergyman and instructed him to try to get some intelligence out of these guys. In other words, before they went off to meet their maker, they needed to get right not only with God, but with George Washington. And again, I put that in my book, and I've mentioned it elsewhere, just because there is this high wall of separation today between the use of clergy for intelligence purposes. In March of 1782, Washington approved an operation that I think gets little attention, but it should get more attention than it deserves, and that was a kidnapping operation designed to kidnap the future King of England, William IV. He was the crown prince at the time. He was visiting New York City on kind of a morale-boosting trip, sort of the Bob Hope of his day. And the United States and Washington got wind of this visit, and the commander-in-chief, actually created a secret team whose goal was to snatch this guy off the streets of Manhattan and to hold him, we're not entirely sure for what purpose, but it may well have been to make an exchange for Benedict Arnold, whom Washington was determined to get, in his clutches and exact revenge for his treason. That's a kind of ruthless operation against is the future king a military target? Sort of, but not entirely. And I think it's the kind of thing that perhaps many Americans are unaware of when they think about George Washington. And the final thing I will say about Washington during the American Revolution was that his use of deception was critical in terms of the Battle of Yorktown, which of course was the decisive victory for the United States during that war. Washington went to great lengths to deceive not only the British that he was planning to move his army south and entrap Cornwallis at Yorktown, but he also thought that in order for that lie to take hold, he needed to deceive his own army, and he also needed to deceive American political officials in Congress and in the various state governorships. So the word was put out that the attack, that the sort of hopefully climactic battle of the revolution was going to occur in New York City, not in the South. So he's deceiving his own government. And I'll just give you another quote here. This is an exchange that Washington had with Noah Webster in 1788, in which he talks about this deception campaign around Yorktown, prior to Yorktown. Quote, "Pains were taken to deceive our own army, for I had always conceived when the imposition did not completely take place at home, it could never sufficiently succeed abroad." So it was important for him that his own troops and that his own political establishment believed that New York City and not somewhere in the South was the next target of the American operations. Now, Washington's post-war agenda, if you will, and that of Hamilton and some of the other nationalists, was, I believe, to transfer this unilateral control that Washington had exercised as commander of the Continental Army into the newly created office of the presidency, in the hopes of allowing this office to conduct a sort of shrewd and coherent foreign policy, and national security policy, we'd call it today. And this involved making sure that the president had certain clandestine tools at his disposal. Washington and Hamilton and other so-called nationalists, I would argue they were nationalists, were convinced that you could not conduct war by committee. And they had a fear of legislative supremacy. You can see this in the Federalist Papers. I believe even Madison argues about, or talks about, this legislative vortex sucking everything, destroying everything in its path. And what you see in Washington's very first address, or very first message to Congress in January 1790, is a request for what's going to become known as a contingency fund, or as it was popularly known at the time, a Secret Service fund. This is a remarkable development in that here you have an American Revolution where I think we have a tendency to believe that it was all about transparency, openness, aversion to centralized power. And yet, in his first annual message to Congress, the president is requesting this Secret Service fund, which would allow the president to spend money without any accounting to Congress. In other words, the initial request was for $40,000. The House would appropriate, the Senate would approve. But after that, after the money is given to the executive branch, the president was not required to provide any sort of accounting as to how that $40,000 was spent. The only thing he was required to do was to say, of the $40,000 appropriated, I spent $32,000. Thank you very much. Now, again, that's a remarkable exception to the idea that Congress is going to control the purse. Congress is going to know where every penny is going. And it's a reflection of Washington's commitment to the notion of presidential control over clandestine operations. Now, I have to be fair about this. Some of that money would go for sort of emergency diplomatic missions, last-minute attempts perhaps to strike a deal when an opening appears. But some of it did go, and certainly over time, a lot of it did go to what we might call secret or clandestine operations. Now, this fund continues on beyond the Washington administration. And I'd like to talk a little bit, since this is Jefferson's birthday, about Jefferson's use of this contingency fund or the Secret Service fund. Because, you might think, reading a typical high school American history text, that the Sage of Monticello was one of our more open, transparent presidents, willing to sort of defer to Congress. Not at all. I mean, if anything, Jefferson was, of the early founders, the most heavily involved in the use of clandestine operations. So despite a lot of statements in favor of deference to Congress and transparency, he really was one of our more Machiavellian presidents. And let me just give you a few examples to support what I'm saying. Even prior to becoming president, when he's serving in France, Jefferson had an agent operating inside the Netherlands who was planting pro-American propaganda in Dutch newspapers, and who also had access to the highest levels of the Dutch government. And of course, one of the top agendas for the U.S. delegation was to secure financial support for the revolutionary cause. He also, amazingly, managed to acquire from the Spanish government a plan to build a canal in Central America. Not in Panama, there was no Panama at the time. But Jefferson was sort of fascinated throughout his life with this idea that you could dig some sort of a pathway between the seas, and authorized or made payments to some operative inside the Spanish government to acquire a map that the Spanish had come up with, a plan to build this kind of canal. As president, his policy towards the Native Americans was one of bribing them into making concessions. Jefferson did not want to maintain a large standing military, so the best way to acquire territory from the Indians was to bribe the chiefs to hand this territory over, or to encourage them to run up massive debts at various trading posts, and then in exchange for these debts, they'd pay it off with land concessions. Jefferson is also the first American president to authorize a covert operation designed to overthrow a foreign head of state. And I'm talking about one of the kings of the Barbary pirates. Call him a foreign head of state. he was, basically. You all know about the war with the Barbary pirates, the conventional sort of naval war, but there was another aspect to that war which involved the plan to topple the king of one of these Barbary clans and who was harassing American and other shipping in the Mediterranean, and replace him with somebody, with the guy's brother, who promised that if you put me on the throne, I won't bother your shipping. So Jefferson sent a special team of 8 to 10 U.S. Marines secretly into North Africa. They rendezvoused with this disgruntled brother of the king, and they actually created a mercenary army that marched against the sitting king. And actually won a major engagement at one point. So point being, you've got a conventional naval battle going on in the Mediterranean, and then you've got an attempt to sort of undermine this guy from within on land. Over time, Jefferson ends up pulling the rug out from under these guys in the field. They literally abandon them in the field, which we also have a pretty lengthy track record of doing. But the pressure did sort of lead at least to a temporary cessation of the harassment of American shipping. Jefferson also used private citizens for intelligence purposes. Again, that was a big issue during the Iran-Contra affair, privatizing intelligence. And one of my favorite Jefferson stories, this is classic Jefferson. After the British burned down the nation's capital during the War of 1812, Jefferson proposed on more than one occasion to people who were around President Madison during the War of 1812, that we retaliate by burning down St. Paul's Cathedral in London. You know, they had destroyed our temples of democracy here. And he was furious with this action. The best way to do that is to hire arsonists in London. He literally gives instructions as to how to do this. You know, there's a lot of poor folks in London. Just spread some gold around. Have them torch St. Paul's Cathedral, and we'll teach those barbarians a lesson. Now, Madison never accepted this proposal, but I think had there been a President Jefferson during the War of 1812, St. Paul's might have been, I have no doubt actually, it would have been torched. So for Jefferson, these kinds of clandestine operations were the perfect way of projecting force. You did not need a large standing military, so they were cheaper. They were less of a threat to liberty at home. You could project force with minimal loss of life, hopefully, certainly of American life, and perhaps you can preserve certain myths that we, the United States, this new empire of liberty, does not operate the same way the old world imperialist colonial powers operate. Jefferson also shared Washington's belief in executive secrecy, believing that even the Senate, forget the House, but even the Senate had no role to play. Let me just read you a quick quote from Jefferson. The Senate is not supposed by the Constitution to be acquainted with the concerns of the executive department, nor are they qualified to judge of the necessity which calls for a mission to any particular place, which special and secret circumstances may require. All this is left to the president. And one point I want to make is if the Founding Fathers were able to come back today, I think they would be particularly disturbed by the role that the House of Representatives plays in this covert arena. They probably would grant that the Senate, despite what I just read, that the Senate would have some role to play. I think they'd be less comfortable with the notion of a House Intelligence Committee knowing the deepest and darkest secrets of the American government. Let me quickly talk about James Madison, since he's such a critical figure, being seen as the architect of the Constitution. You do see, I would say, less of an attraction on Madison's part to these kinds of operations, but still, he was willing to do so if need be. Another one of my favorite stories is when Madison was serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State, In 1805, they received a request from one of the Barbary pirate states. They were sending an ambassador to the United States, and the ambassador requested that he be provided with a prostitute by the U.S. government as sort of a welcoming gift. I would love to have overheard this conversation between little Jimmy Madison, all dressed in black, all 5'3" of them, asking Jefferson, what should we do for this request for a prostitute? But they granted the request. They took the money out of the contingency fund, which was designed to improve foreign intercourse, and I'll leave it at that. But 2 covert operations were authorized by President Madison after he succeeds Jefferson. One in the part of Florida called West Florida at the time, which is essentially the panhandle part, where you had a lot of American settlers who were living under Spanish authority and who spontaneously rose up and overthrew this weak Spanish garrison. It didn't take much of an effort. All of that was directed and controlled from the White House. There was a second operation in East Florida, which is more of the peninsula part of Florida, that was far less successful. It didn't succeed. But they tried the same thing to sort of generate something spontaneous and internal. The problem there in East Florida was you had a lot of runaway slaves who were simply not interested in joining the Empire of Liberty. And you also had a number, of course, Seminole Indians who felt the same way. So they resisted these attempts. But the point being, both of those attempts were made. Both of them were directed or launched and supported by the U.S. government. And in the aftermath of both of these operations, the Madison administration, shall we say, dissembled, were less than truthful in terms of providing an account of what had occurred in the Floridas. In other words, they denied any connection whatsoever. The final Madison event that I'll mention is during the War of 1812, when the New England Federalists were talking about possibly, well, they were resisting the war, and some were even talking about secession. The Madison administration was approached by, I believe he was a Canadian, who said he had in his possession letters that would indicate that various New England Federalists had been engaged in treasonous talks with British operatives in Canada. And Madison authorized the payment of $50,000 out of the contingency fund to purchase these letters in the hopes that it would reveal the treachery of these New England Federalists. The letters turned out to be kind of a bust. But I've always thought it was interesting that the so-called architect of the Constitution, again, did not seem to share this notion of the sanctity of the mails. And in fact, was more than willing to allow these documents to be released to the public if it would embarrass his Federalist opponents. All right, in conclusion, let me say, and I could go on with these stories throughout the 19th century of President Lincoln, for instance, during the Civil War, but we don't have time for that. Let me acknowledge that there are or have been certain changes in technology and just in the creation of these sort of large bureaucratic entities like the CIA, like the NSA. So I'm not trying to say that there were parallels to an agency like the CIA during this period. There certainly were not. Although you could also argue that the kind of bureaucratic controls that exist make those entities in some ways more disciplined and more subject to control than these kind of freelancers that were hired by Washington and Madison and Jefferson. By the way, people tend to say the first bureaucratic agency created was the Office of Strategic dealing with intelligence and clandestine operations was the Office of Strategic Services in 1941 under FDR. It's actually the Office of Naval Intelligence, which was created in 1882 and remained in existence to this day. Let me conclude by noting that in the 41 years between the time Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and the time James Madison left the White House in 1817, the nascent American government had authorized an astounding variety of covert operations, including kidnapping attempts, bribing foreign leaders, using clergy and media for intelligence purposes, overthrowing a foreign government, and assisting insurgencies. Now, we can dismiss in 2016 the founders as irrelevant, and we can proclaim that we have evolved beyond their primitive ways. But what one cannot honestly do, I believe, is enlist them in the cause of limiting or banning these operations. For these operations are as American as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. These men viewed the international arena as a Byzantine world of high-stakes competition where traditional standards of decency were seldom observed. And I would contend, so should we. Thank you very much. Hopefully that has generated some questions. So, thank you. I sometimes hesitate giving this talk because it plays into the hands of I wouldn't even call him an historian, but people like Howard Zinn, who think that America was rotten from the start, and all these guys were, but so be it. It's the truth, and the truth shall set you free, as the Bible says. So. Sure, sir.
Yes. I noticed you didn't mention President John Adams.
I didn't, yeah.
Do you have any anecdotes or any of his perspectives on these issues?
That's a great question. During the revolution, so being an envoy, most of what I could tell you would be non-presidential. It would be his service in Europe. So he was aware of the kind of activities that Jefferson and the others were engaged in terms of winning foreign support, whether it was through overt appeals or covert appeals. But you raise a good point. Adams sort of stands out. I looked long and hard. There's not a lot to find as President Adams. The one thing I did find was when Hamilton was put in charge, essentially under George Washington of the Army during the Quasi-War, one of Hamilton's first requests was for an appropriation of $500,000 to be inserted into this contingency fund. And because he's assuming that they're going to need access to a sizable chunk of money for various intelligence operations, of which I'm not sure what. But the interesting thing about Hamilton's request for that $500,000 is he does say, if it's necessary, if Congress is a little concerned about the size of that request, we can have 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate sign off on these, on the specifics of these expenditures. That was very interesting. It was something you might expect to hear from Jefferson instead of from Hamilton. But no, I can't stand up here and give you a lot of examples of Adams, and I don't know if that's due to his neo-puritanical New England, but there's not a lot.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
With the continuity of that Secret Service fund throughout the first 4 or 5 presidencies, was there ever an attempt to formalize a bureaucracy organization? Did it ever delegate to a director outside of the president himself?
No, it was, I should have made this clear, however, it was delegated to the Secretary of State. So the fund was administered by the State Department and stayed there up until the 20th century.
Do you ever get a sense of how many of these plans were they always concocted the president himself or the sex state, or like any way with the approval process looks? When you look at our processes now for stuff like that, it's pretty insane.
Sure. My impression was they were frequently generated by the State Department, and the president was asked to approve. So I would actually put, with the exception of Jefferson, I would actually put most of the onus on the State Department. Yeah. Yeah, sir.
In light of the evidence to the contrary, why do you suppose that today people like Rand
Yeah. I don't think they know the past very well. They have a sort of vague, they have a understanding of privacy and of limited government that's really not what the founders were about. It's more what, what's her name, Ayn Rand was about, and Frederick Hayek. So they talk a good game, but I just don't have a great impression that they really. I've written a couple of these. I wrote a piece on this guy, Justin Amash, who's one of the key members of the Freedom Caucus up on the Hill. And if he had his way, he'd shut down the NSA tomorrow. And I've looked long and hard, and he cites the Constitution and he invokes the framers, but it never goes beyond, there's no detail there. And he seems just to be heavily influenced by his contempt for government and his belief that you may have more to fear from the American government than you do from ISIS. But I don't get the sense that this guy knows his history. Rand Paul, by the way, said that Edward Snowden would be treated quite well by history. I mean, in my view, Edward Snowden is a defector. But again, their contempt for this government exceeds that of many foreign governments. Go ahead, Ken. I knew you were coming, so I braced myself. I figured you were going to try to trip me up.
No, it's under progressivism, with its emphasis on humanitarian goals and so on.
Yeah.
Is there any change in attitude toward covert operations?
Yeah, you would think so, but no, because I didn't deal with this, but I have a chapter in my book that deals with Woodrow Wilson. I mean, his use of the Office of Naval Intelligence to conduct not only what we'd classify as just intelligence gathering in Mexico, for instance, it goes way beyond that. The Office of Naval Intelligence was trying to influence elections in Mexico, was trying to buy pro-American editorials through the Mexican press. I mean, just an aggressive, classic covert operation designed to avert conflict and to keep the Mexicans friendly towards the United States. So Wilson, who I believe you would agree is one of the key progressive founders, was a real believer in the utility of these kinds of operations. So
I would think that with increased immigration and communist subversion and so forth, the Japanese issue as well, that there would be more of an inclination, I mean, not just a racist impulse, but a real concern about subversion.
absolutely.
Internal and going to the source.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you see this under the next great progressive, who was Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah, I mean, in answer to your, again, going back to your original question, there's no halt under the progressive presidents. If anything, there's a escalation in the use of these kinds of I mean, FDR would be Edward Snowden's worst nightmare. I mean, he was wiretapping everybody who was the least bit suspect, including people involved in the America First movement, including Wendell Willkie, his 1940 Republican opponent. We don't have a lot of tape recordings of FDR's discussions from the Oval Office, but one that we do have shows him trying to plant stories or urging the planting of stories about Willkie's extramarital affair in 1940, which had been picked up through some FBI surveillance. So the FBI becomes something of the president's private detective agency under J. Edgar Hoover, and FDR loved every minute of it. So, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So, but is there a way to have some sort of check on abuse of legitimate, let's say legitimate spying and espionage versus stuff like this?
Yeah. I do think, look, the fact is that particularly under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, well, really starting with FDR, but that this kind of power was abused, and the Church Committee was certainly on to something important. What I disagree, where I break ranks is, well, first of all, they claim that all this stuff begins in the 20th century. They actually had one volume of the Church Committee report was devoted to kind of a historical look, and they completely missed the boat on these precedents that I talked about here. But where I really break ranks with on the Church Committee was the recommendation that both the House and the Senate create permanent intelligence committees. I really don't think the House has a role to play here. But if you insist on that, then to me the solution would have been some type of joint oversight committee, typical to the old atomic energy oversight committee that existed, where you had a few members from the Senate, a few from the House. So you limit the membership, you try to avoid partisan infighting, you avoid infighting between the Senate and the House. Something probably like that needed to be done, but I think they went way too far in terms of giving both the House and the Senate oversight authority over these secret arms of the government. And I think there was a real cost to that. I mean, I'm not going to stand up here and say that things like 9/11 could have been avoided if we hadn't gone down this path, but we did engage in a kind of remarkable experiment in terms of power sharing over the secret arms of our government, and I think it had an impact in terms of the CIA became far more risk averse. The legal restrictions that were placed on entities like the CIA and the NSA, less so, made it difficult to penetrate groups like Al-Qaeda, who had been at war with the United States for 5 years prior to 9/11. There's just so many. Go ahead. Were you raising? Oh, there were. Sure. Okay. Well, it just seems to me that what happened with the creation of these two permanent intelligence oversight committees is they turned the CIA into just another sclerotic Washington bureaucracy.
So,
yeah.
Following on that, I've had the opportunity to serve in senior positions in the U.S. Intelligence Community, and I've been on the team of the oversight. And I think we would be remiss if we neglect to mention in this conversation that oversight, in addition to checks on the executive branch committee, also entails evaluating for improvement what is done and what the resources are and the capabilities might be. And so I would just, to round out the picture, suggest
Sure.
that there's a positive role, in addition to a check on the abuse of power, the positive role of looking at the opportunities that may be otherwise missed, but for congressional rejection.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Again, I would only push back in this regard. I still think we don't need two separate oversight entities, but.
Well, it seems like much like all other appropriations and authorization activities that take place, House side, Senate side, and the reconciliation of those things is sort of the regular order of business. Maybe you have a point to make why there should be an exception.
That's right. I think there should be an exception.
But I made that. It's a fair conversation to have, but I would observe that there are plenty of very closely held secret activities beyond intelligence activities that are subject to standard appropriations and authorizations on both sides of the hill. So if you're going to go down that path, maybe intellectual rigor would suggest looking at the full range of those things. I don't know whether you still come to the same conclusion.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Thanks.
Looks like we had a couple other questions.
Yeah,
We should
sorry.
wrap up after that.
Yes, sir.
It's more detailed. Was there 10 from the prince known to the British and,
Yeah,
and to himself? And what kind of impact on
the attempt was discovered by the British prior to the attempt actually being made, which is why it did not succeed. So in other words, somehow through British penetration of Washington's inner circles, they knew that this secret team was training and had been created, and its goal was to snatch this guy off the streets. So what they did was they doubled his guard and they restricted his schedule. They just made it impossible for it to succeed. So that's actually an instance where British counterintelligence, I guess, succeeded in blunting one of Washington's more aggressive endeavors. Sorry, there was somebody. Yeah.
So with the hindsight of historical record on the first early presidents, I mean, is there a way to measure success of the approved? I mean, if you had a number, the ones that you
Sure.
stated between the 40 to 41 years of
Yeah.
situation, was there a success rate that someone can semi-objectively look at and go, yes? But that's always kind of the question.
Sure.
With the plan and covert activities.
Yeah, I mean, presidents are drawn to these things because they frequently think there'll be a magic bullet.
Sure.
They'll get them out of some sticky situation. And more than not, I think they tend to fail. It's a great question. I can't give you a percentage figure. The operation under Madison in West Florida succeeded like a charm. The one in East Florida was a disaster and an embarrassment. And by the way, the agent who was sent down there to run it was heading back to Washington, as he put it, to blow the cover off the whole thing when he died of natural causes. I believe he probably did, but Oliver Stone would love to get his hands on a story like this. Yeah. So I think more, and the one in North Africa to overthrow the Pasha of Tripoli, partial success in that it did apply pressure. It does seem to have scared that guy. And in concert with the naval resistance in the Mediterranean, altered policy, at least for a time.
Marines got a him out of it.
The Marines got their ham out of it to the shores of Tripoli, comes from that operation. Washington's operations during the American Revolution, Washington, was convinced that they were critical. And I'm convinced that we only know like the half of it. One of those comments to Noah Webster, he says a lot of what I'm telling, he talks about how some of the details of what went on will be taken to the grave. In other words, he did not tell him everything. And I'm sure we don't know everything, but he was convinced that they were essential. And at Yorktown, that does seem to be they were part of a variety of pieces that had to come together, but it was one of the pieces that helped. So, good question. Yeah.
I think we should wrap up. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Knott for coming. Let's all
Thank you. Thanks.